cage. Lock yourself in.
Professor Ross Garnaut, you are in the cage. The premise of the cage is that we lock you in until you've answered the question. The question is always the same. How are you contributing to the creation of a post-carbon world? And in your case, the latest contribution is your latest book, Reset, building on previous books like Superpower and all the way back to your creation of a carbon tax for the Rudd-Gillard government. Perhaps you could show us Reset.
Well, I hope this will get me out of the cage this time, and I hope you'll take into account my earlier contributions. But Reset goes a step further than my last book, Superpower. Superpower told the story of how we had great economic opportunities if we embraced the zero emissions economy. Reset, Restoring Australia after the pandemic recession, tells us that we don't have much choice. We'll grasp that opportunity or we're back in the dog days.
So the fact that Superpower hasn't been adopted and resonates for me with your comment that I hope you get out of the cage this time. Your recommendations on a carbon tax for Australia were short-lived. Can you just comment on the relationship between the politics of the day and the kind of recipes that someone like you might recommend to politicians?
Well, I had two shots at carbon pricing. One was for all of the state premiers and territory chief ministers and the Prime Minister. That was my first climate change review when Kevin Rudd was Prime Minister. Well, at least it led to recommendations for a carbon price that were accepted by the House of Representatives. Didn't get through the Senate, largely because Tony Abbott took over the Leader of the Opposition job from Malcolm Turnbull by a single vote after Malcolm had said he would pass it in the Senate. Then we had another shot when we had a multi-party committee for climate change under Julia Bishop as Prime Minister. This time it did get all the way through and became law, and for 2 years it worked, and emissions fell by 7 or 8% per annum for 2 years, and it didn't wipe Whyalla off the map. It was working exactly as it should have, without any economic side effects. Ordinary Australians prospered under it, but that was abolished by Tony Abbott. My book Superpower also had some effect. It's been very influential with state governments, I think, and including Conservative state governments. New South Wales, South Australia, Tasmania all have Liberal governments, and all are well along the superpower track. But I must say I haven't yet permanently persuaded the Conservatives in Canberra, but I hope that's not enough to keep me in the cage.
So, I mean, you're able to crack a smile about it, but that must be fairly frustrating as someone who's thought as deeply as you have about these solutions.
Oh, there have been depressing moments, that's for sure, Jeff, but it's not too late for us to still avoid the worst effects of climate change. Now, it is too late to avoid some quite serious effects. But we were always going to take a while to deal with things. If we get cracking now, really make ourselves part of a global effort to reach zero emissions by the middle of the century, hopefully a bit before that, we can certainly keep global temperature increases below 2 degrees. Go a bit further than that, aim for zero emissions a decade earlier than that, and we'll keep it to 1.5 degrees. That will avoid a lot of problems for our grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Still worth doing, although it would have been easier if we got going earlier.
So I just want to run through some of the elements of I'm calling it a recipe, the ingredients of the recipe that is the basis of Reset. The work that you put in Superpower is, summarised in 1 or 2 chapters for reset, and the elements that I took as being most important for that are hydrogen as the basis of a renewable energy carrier, you know, a way of carrying that energy and using that to power a green metals, green steel and green aluminium industry. Also the basis of perhaps a renewable transport sector, which goes hand in hand with the electrification of transport. And then the use of biomass to fuel plastics, pharmaceuticals, all of the things that we can use biomass to replace fossil fuels for. So that's a sort of very technical part of the solution and is more or less aligned with the federal government's technology roadmap. Is that true? Is that a reasonable summary?
Well, you could say it's true, although of course all those ideas were out there in superpower before the Commonwealth Government's roadmap, so you could see it as them aligning themselves with superpower, but it doesn't matter which way we look at it. The federal government's ideas on technology are okay. The 5 priority technologies all have a place to play, and I said in superpower that they would all be a part of the solution. They're not the only technologies that are relevant, but we also need a destination. A roadmap without a destination's not as helpful as one with one. We need to know where we're going, and that has to be at very least zero emissions by the middle of the century. And the Commonwealth roadmap is a roadmap without an engine, without an engine to carry you across the landscape.
And so you see an emissions target as an essential element, or the essential element of that destination?
Well, it's an essential element, but you also need a motor to carry you towards that, and that means policies, and there's a range of relevant policies. You're quite right in your introduction to say that the 2 foundations of Australia as the superpower of the zero emissions world economy are our capacity to produce very low cost electricity in a zero emissions world, because we've got the best combinations of wind and solar in the developed world. The other foundation, the other building block is our capacity to absorb carbon in the landscape and grow biomass. We've got much more land per head of population or compared with the size of our economy than any other developed country. A lot of that land's not all that valuable in intensive agriculture, so it'll be more valuable in absorbing carbon and growing biomass for industry than in other uses. And those 2 advantages really set Australia up, and just as well they do, because the story of Reset is a story of how we face some pretty big headwinds unless we embrace these new opportunities. But these new opportunities are so big that they can overcome the headwinds. Okay, so seeing the energy, the replacement of fossil fuels as one ingredient, and the sequestration of carbon into the soil as a second ingredient. One largely deals with the transport and the energy production sector, which of course is roughly 2/3 to 3/4 of global emissions, depending which country you look at. And the agriculture sector, the sort of what we think of as the rural industries in Australia, are also a significant contributor to climate change, but also many of the other environmental challenges we face, like biodiversity loss, the loss of nutrition from soil and pollution of our waterways. So the role of carbon in the soil and the other rural aspects that you point to in Reset can have significant impacts on some of those other problems. Do you just want to address that for a moment? Yes, I sure can. And I'll talk for the moment about the second set of issues, carbon in the landscape. I've got a chapter of that in Reset. It was part of my original climate change review for all the premiers and for Prime Minister Rudd, and part of the report I gave Prime Minister Gillard's multi-party committee on climate change. So it's been the theme since the beginning, but we know more about how to make it work now. and it can be very big. And
So two essential elements of that. One are the is the carbon that the plants put into the soil through their roots and through the, just the generation of life into the soil and the carbon that life leaves behind. The other is the burying of biochar or char through pyrolysis. But the other parts of your carbon sequestration recipe include timber buildings and the use of biomass for the production of things that we currently use fossil fuel for.
Yeah, that's right. There's two basic ways in which you can absorb carbon in the landscape. One is carbon in soils, the other is in living plants. And we can take a fair bit of both. In fact, we will probably absorb as much carbon as Australia is going to emit from all its existing activities between now and 2050 by making good use of our carbon in the soils. Some of these new sources of carbon you can harvest sustainably, and a lot of Australian plants, because they've adapted to our fire-prone environment, are very good at that. You can cut them off and they grow again. I mention in the book the mallee, which is a big story in southern Australia in drier areas. The mallee is used to fire coming every now and again and cutting it off the stump, so it grows its trunk underground. The trunk gets bigger and bigger. We call it a mallee root, but it's actually mallee trunk, and just sprouts again. And so you're sequestering more and more carbon under the ground at the same time as you're renewing biomass above the ground. Now, if you're only interested in carbon, you just have one plant, mallee, dominating in one region, mulga in another. In the top end it might be the red mahogany eucalypt, but often this will have other environmental negative effects. Got to take account of biodiversity, and fortunately Australian governments are starting to recognise that there are multiple environmental values that we've got to care about, and if you've got rewards for capturing carbon at the same time as you've got rewards for biodiversity, and you're allowed to put these together, then managing your plants so that you get a lot of carbon but also maintain biodiversity happens through market processes. Queensland's Land Restoration Fund allows that because it makes payments on top of the carbon you get. So if we're clever, we can have our carbon cake and eat it as well.
All right, well, I do want to move on to the economic parts of your strategy rather than the technical ones that we've just talked about, but I'm just going to take a short break there so that you can make yourself comfortable in the cage.
Well, I'm hoping to get out of the cage in my next set of answers, but we'll see how I go.
The Cage.
The Cage is physically in the Triple Z FM studios in Brisbane, Australia. Great place to lock people up. Australia's an island continent as far from the North Atlantic as you can get. A colonial artefact that started life as a prison camp run by the British Navy. As a consequence, we've got refugees in gulags in the Coral Sea to teach them not to get into boats. We've got Indigenous kids in facilities where we tear gas them in their beds to teach them a lesson. And we routinely kill prisoners as part of our deaths in custody program to teach their friends a lesson. But we encourage you to come enjoy our good fresh food, our great beaches, and throw another prawn on the barbie because we're really nice to tourists.
The Cage. Lock yourself in.
This is Jeff Ebbs. I have Ross Garnaut in the cage, and we're talking to Professor Garnaut about his new book, Reset.
It's a story of how Australia can come out of the pandemic recession with full employment and rising incomes, and grasping our low carbon opportunity is the key to that. In fact, I argue that there's no alternative. The alternative to grabbing that opportunity and achieving full employment with rising incomes is return to what I call the dog days that we had before the pandemic recession.
Okay, so full employment and rising incomes are economic terms. You're an economist. We've already talked about some of the technical or practical ways that we can reduce our carbon emissions and sequester carbon into the soil. So let's move on to those economic solutions. One of the ways that you talk about managing to achieve full employment and with manageable debt is what you call the Australian Income Security. I think I've got that a little bit wrong. Perhaps you can correct me there, which is a sort of model of a universal basic income. Do you want to talk to that for a moment?
Yeah, so well, first, what do we mean by full employment? Full employment is as close as possible to everyone who wants a job having that job and as many hours of employment as they want. And we won't know when we're there until the labour market is so tight, people are finding jobs so easily that wages are rising in the marketplace. So the test of full employment is whether wages are rising. Well, it's a long time since market pressures have led to increasing wages in Australia, but that's where we need to be for full employment. And our objective should be full employment and rising incomes. We can get to full employment just by spending a lot more government money, double the size of JobKeeper and JobSeeker, and that will get us to full employment. But it won't be sustainable, it won't be followed by rising incomes. It'll lead to excessive debt. So we've got to do those things together. We also have to have some structural reforms to use our labour and our skills more productively. And I'm suggesting two big reforms to do that. One is a change in the corporate income tax away from the conventional corporate tax towards a cash flow tax. That will give businesses much more incentive for investment and innovation. It'll take more tax away from companies that are sitting on their laurels and just living off their past. The second reform is bringing together our tax and social security system. So we've got one system and paying nearly all Australians, all except those on very high incomes and with considerable wealth, all other Australians getting a payment equal to the unemployment benefit fortnightly into their bank account, and then taxing income from the first dollar at a moderate rate, somewhere in the 30s%, and avoiding all of those poverty traps where people going from a moderate number of hours of work to full-time employment can lose most, or some cases even all, of the extra income because of losing their social security and higher taxes. We would avoid all of that.
So let's break those two apart, because they are both controversial ideas in some circles, and I want to sort of whack them into pretty simple terms so that the people who come up with three-word slogans that might rubbish those things, that we can deal with the kinds of problems. So let's start with the idea of making sure that people have enough money to live on, to avoid the poverty trap. Since we're trying to manage full employment and debt levels, it may seem counterintuitive to some people, that we would give people money when they're not working. Surely that would reduce employment and increase debt, but you're suggesting that it's a way to head towards full employment and manageable debt.
Well, full employment you've got to get to through other mechanisms. That's what I've got to say about monetary policy, making sure we don't have higher interest rates than the rest of the world, making sure that our central bank is doing as much to expand the money supply.
But you are suggesting that sort of payment couldn't help people get out of the poverty trap that stops them from working.
What the minimum basic income or the negative income tax does, I call it Australian Income Security, because the amount of money they lose through taxation once they're in the labour force is moderate. They've got an incentive to work the number of hours they would like to work. They don't lose all of the extra money. Now what that will do is, once we've got full employment, that will encourage them to participate more in the labour force. That will increase the size of the economy after we've got full employment. It's not so essential for getting to full employment, it's essential for expanding the economy once we're at full employment. Once we've got everyone in a job who wants one, and they'll want to work more if they're keeping more of their income. How it helps achieve full employment is, achieving full employment requires doing a lot of things to improve productivity, and sometimes that's fairly disruptive. People will be prepared to accept that disruption if they think that the overall framework of policy is fair, if the benefits of what we're doing is distributed fairly, and the income tax reform, the social security reform around Australian income security will increase awareness that the overall effects of what we're doing is fair. That will make reform politically manageable and give us the productivity growth that will help full employment. So indirectly it helps full employment, and it makes the economy bigger after we've got to full employment.
And so what about its impact on debt?
The level of debt is largely determined by at full employment by the balance we maintain between increasing government demand and having growth in our export industries, our trade exposed industries. We can't get to full employment just by expanding government expenditure funded by debt, but if we do everything that way, and that's what we've had so far, the big employment growth we've had since the depth of COVID in the middle of last year has largely come through that government expenditure. Very welcome, it was the right thing to do. But it doesn't lead to rising incomes when you get to full employment, and it doesn't lead to sustainable full employment because you're left with excessive debt. We've got to make sure that alongside that we get a lot of investment and growth in our export industries. We get that through the corporate tax reform, I suggest, by not running monetary policy so tight that we keep the exchange rate high, and we get that by embracing the new export opportunities in the low carbon economy.
Well, let's just focus on that corporate tax return. One way that I understand your notions about that corporate tax return, which I just want to check with you, is a reasonably good approximation of what you're saying, is that when we have people making money from their assets, they are essentially living or increasing their wealth based on notions of rent. And so it's not going into productive capital. So you've got gains based on exclusive ownership of assets.
Yeah.
Whereas when people are generating profits and wealth for themselves out of productive investment, then they are contributing to the economy and the growth for everybody. And so some people call that rentierism, there's other names for it, but essentially we're talking about lazy money and, perhaps undeserved or unearned wealth versus productive wealth that's invested in industries that, benefit the kind of economic growth that you're saying we need to look for.
I think that's a fair way of looking at it, Jeff, and I explain the story.
Yeah, I got those ideas from you.
in one chapter of Reset, and what we're trying to do is lighten the tax burden on businesses that are investing heavily and especially that are innovating, and increase the tax burden on the rest. We can't reduce the overall corporate tax burden. We can't afford it. We can't have a fair society that will support the reform that's necessary for full employment with rising income if we're cutting overall contributions from the corporate sector. But this tax reform will at least maintain total revenue from the corporate sector while shifting the burden away from those who are innovating and investing towards those who are sitting on their laurels.
So isn't this dangerously close to a mixed economy? I mean, you're essentially an economist, not a red flag waving lefty. So How are these ideas going to go down with what we think of as the financial establishment and the conservative forces who tend to protect wealth and generating money from assets?
Well, what I'm proposing is certainly consistent with a vigorous and expanding market economy. But I do say in the book we've got to strike the right balance between the market economy and services provided by government. There's no economic basis for saying that we have to keep shrinking the public sector and expanding the market part of the economy. There are some parts of the economy that work best as a market economy. Effectively, all those parts where you can have real competition.
So do you think the pendulum swung as far as it's going towards the neoliberalism market?
Well, I think the pendulum swung too far that way. Maybe in Australia in the early years after the Second World War it was too far the other way. I think that the reforms of the Hawke era and subsequent governments for a while in the 80s and 90s got it back in the right place. The pendulum kept swinging and it's gone too far the other way. As a result, our economic performance was weak in the 7 years before the pandemic, and we'll need the right balance between government provision and services and market provision of services to restore economic growth. You don't get good economic outcomes if you're trying to do through the market some things that are better done through the state. You need the right balance.
And so looking around the world, what types of governments have got that balance right? I mean, American conservatives have criticised Europe for being social democratic and not supporting a free market. Are the Europeans closer to the kind of model that you're talking about?
I think what Australia had for a while was pretty right, and through the late 80s, 90s, early in the 20th century. And while the pendulum has been swinging outside the optimal territory, it hasn't gone so far, and so we haven't damaged our society as much as the Americans or British have. And the fact that our democracy remains in a better state than them is reflected in the way we manage the pandemic better. Now, in the US, there's widespread recognition in the community that they've gone far too far towards raw market exchange as the way of conducting economic activity, and we're seeing a big move back from that in the move from Trump to Biden. Now, the US starts in a very different place. They don't have the equivalent of Medicare. That was a big problem for them in managing COVID. Initially, to get tested, you had to pay a large amount of money that a lot of ordinary Americans couldn't afford, and that was a constraint on management of the spread of the disease. Well, we, with Medicare and basic medical services, were in a much better position to combat the virus. Of course, the biggest difference between us and America there was that our governments, federal and state, took medical science seriously, whereas Trump denied the medical science. But beyond that, the fact that we had reasonable public health systems, including Medicare, but also the public health systems administered through the states, meant that we had the wherewithal for dealing with the pandemic. The US didn't have those basic building blocks, and as a result, more people have died from COVID than died in all the foreign wars America's fought since the War of Independence.
And how would you characterise Europe?
Well, Europe's a different story in different places. Certainly Central Europe, Northern Europe are largely social democratic states with a much larger, proportionally larger public sector than Australia, and alongside that higher taxation. But I don't think any is a perfect model for Australia. I think we can do things better than others. I think in times past we have done things better than others. We don't have to find a foreign model that suits us. We've just got to properly analyse our circumstances, produce the best outcome for ourselves, and that's what Reset's all about.
All right, well, let's take another break there, and I'll come back and talk about some of the things that I think are outside your recipe that I'd like to get your